Padmaja Sarathy. I apologize for the little bit of technical difficulty we had, and we are trying to do something to overcome that. Today's topic is proactive interventions and supports for students with autism spectrum disorders. One of the things that impacts students with autism are some of their behaviors. And then it also connects with how they are learning in the classroom and how the instruction is proceeding, and it impacts their peers and impacts the teachers and the paraprofessional and all the therapists who are working with that classroom or working with that child. So it is extremely important that these children have that environmental supports and the instructional supports so that they are successfully adjusting and adapting to the classroom and successful with their learning outcomes. Looks like I need, I was going to explain, it looks like we have, okay. What we are going to be focusing on today, what are some proactive strategies that you can use in order to create a supportive learning environment for children in the autism spectrum disorders? You will be able to get new ideas and maybe get your existing ideas validated on what kind of environment you can create so that you can reduce the problem behaviors as well as increase the student engagement during your instruction. We will also talk about what are some instructional flexibility that you can use. What are some instructional adaptations that you can use? And we will also talk about one of the most important things that children with autism need to learn, self-regulation and calming strategies. Next slide, please. Of a number of books. And one of the books, as you can see on this slide, all of the books are books that I have written. I have served as an educational consultant and continue to do that role, as well as being a program supervisor for special education programs for several years. And my most recent book, as a matter of fact, is this one on behavior intervention strategies. And it just came out. It's a second edition, completely revised and rewritten, that you can see on this screen here. I also have another one, a mini guide on autism spectrum disorders and behavior guide, para-educators, focused on young children. I also am the founder and president of a nonprofit organization, and this is a parenting guide that I just came out in 2020. Anyway, moving on to the next slide. One of the first steps, I'm sure most of you are familiar with the ABC chain. One of the first step is how do we understand why and how and what kind of behavior the student is exhibiting. And it is important first to actually describe that behavior precisely. Instead of making a kind of a broad statement that he's aggressive or he's non-compliant or he's very disrespectful, we have to identify clearly what kind of behavior. We have to be very precise in defining it. Is he throwing pencil? Is he refusing to do a task that's been assigned to her or him? Or is he or she fighting with another student, taking the materials from another student, pinching or hitting either a peer or an adult? Or is the student running away from the classroom or running away from the group? and running away from a task that you have assigned. So you have to be able to clearly and precisely define that behavior so that you can take the appropriate action in terms of positively addressing that behavior. And it is also important to get an understanding, clear understanding of what are some antecedents that trigger that problem behavior so that your solution, your consequence, and the behavior that the student exhibits are appropriately addressed. Is the student, most often they are trying to either get attention or they are trying to escape a task. We all know that. So what is it that's triggering that behavior? It's important to clearly get an understanding of that. Next slide, please. In using a positive PBIS, positive behavior intervention and support, one of the first things you do is you use proactive strategies, not reactive strategies, but proactive strategies so that your environment is supportive. And that's what today's webinar is all about. So that you try to remove those events that trigger that problem behavior. For example, this is a child. He doesn't like to stop playing with Lego blocks and move to a small group activity. Every time you're asking him to stop, let's say this is a child who's either in first grade or kindergarten and is in centers, and then he always chooses to play with blocks, though I would suggest, there are times when that is not a choice for him, maybe a couple of other choices. You have to build his interest in other things as well. But in the beginning, let's assume he's only interested in playing with Lego blocks. And then he refuses to move to a small group activity. How do we prepare that student? You have to have some kind of an advance warning, let's say 5 minutes before, 1 minute before, and that's a proactive strategy that gradually move him to that small group activity. So that is a practice, and it may have to happen many times before it becomes part of David's routine to be able to make that transition. The other thing that you want to do for a child who is experiencing difficult, challenging behavior, you want to teach new skills to the student. And those new skills will replace the problem behaviors. So teach, for example, a child who runs to use walking feet, both in the classroom and in the hallway. But he can run in the playground, but in the hallway and in the classroom, he learns to use calm walking feet. Teach the student who is feeling agitated and fidgety, instead of throwing a tantrum, maybe you can gradually teach him how to request help and maybe have either a small assistive technology device that helps him to ask for a break, or a picture card that helps him to ask for a break when he's feeling frustrated. The other thing is responding to problem behavior. One of the things that often happens is children with autism who engage in challenging behaviors get a lot of no's and don'ts and stop that, a lot of negatives. So how do we build in that positive so that they do get approval and a positive stroke when they are exhibiting appropriate behavior, even if it is for a brief moment? Mark was immediately, let's say, praised, even though he was kind of whining all the way from the bus to the classroom. We try to ignore it because this is something you have seen. I mean, we can address that behavior too, but let's say he comes in the classroom, but somehow he follows that routine and he hangs his backpack in the right place. And immediately I like the way you hung that backpack. Great job, Mark. You did that. Instead of just saying great job, it is important to point out the appropriate behavior that Mark displayed, that is hanging in the backpack, so that he will continue to repeat that behavior, and also that positive stroke will help him feel good. So those high fives, positive strokes, and expressing through your body language and facial expression are very important for Mark. Next slide, please. So what are some principles of positive behavior intervention support? I know most of you know that. That is a team process, and you conduct a FBA, and then this team has created the functional behavior assessment, and then based on that you have an intervention plan, and then you also have a debriefing period when if there is a crisis, and then you make some changes and corrections to that FBA. One of the most important things we all have to understand is prevention is the best cure. Okay, and I'm sure you all. But in addition to that, we have to make sure our classroom climate is very positive. And one of the things, many of these classrooms that serve children with autism may have additional para-educator support staff. So one of the things that you can do is to keep a close eye, close supervision and monitoring, so that when we see some fidgety behaviors, we can address it immediately. And the other thing is, on a regular basis, we teach the classroom rules, make those classroom rules simple, and pair them with photographs. Next slide, please.
Padmaja, next up, we have a poll regarding what problem behaviors people are experiencing.
Okay, thank you. So what are some of the problem behaviors that you do see? You see screaming, kicking, or running around the classroom, or hitting and pinching adults, pushing away objects, throwing objects. Okay, you are completing the poll. And running around the classroom.
Go for just a little bit longer. Most people are still completing the poll.
Yes. And again, I apologize for the technology issue that I keep saying. Next slide, please. I don't know what's happening. Sometimes technology is not all that cooperative. One of the major problems that I see is refusing to do the assigned task. Okay, that is comparatively, I would say, a milder problem, though if it happens too frequently, it can be very annoying, I agree. And throwing away and pushing away objects does not seem to be such a major problem, which is good. The next two are running around the classroom and screaming and kicking and transitioning. And I am going to talk about the fact that transitioning is one of the major challenges. Okay, so if we can move out of this, stop sharing the poll results, we can see that the largest percentage, about close to 40%, is refusing to do the assigned task. Okay. And what are some environmental interventions that we can use? How do we design that physical environment of the classroom so that it is proactive, so that before the behavior occurs, you have prevented it? One of the things is making sure some of the auditory and visual distractions are eliminated. What do I mean by visual distraction? Many classrooms have a variety of displays on the wall. If we can limit that to just one or two things, maybe you have a math wall and maybe you have a vocabulary wall. And maybe in addition to that, you have a calendar. And if you do want to display some things, maybe you can change that periodically, let's say every 3 weeks or something, so that you do not have at any given time too many visual displays which can add to the stress level of students with autism. The same way, making sure that the auditory distractions are eliminated so that there is no background music, there is no background talk, there is no chatter going on in the background. That's one thing. The other thing is clearly defined visual boundaries, and I'm going to show you a slide that shows that a little bit more, and then label the various activity areas. Like if you have centers that, or if you have math area and science area that, or if you have a safe space in the classroom for children to calm down, clearly marked and labeled there. And then the other things that you want to do is rearrange the seating so that you are seating peers, especially this is applicable if it is an inclusive setting, but if you're seating or children who don't exhibit challenging behavior next to those who do engage in those kind of behaviors, then you have a good model next. So these are all things that are very simple to achieve. And for some students, you may have to have a study carrel. That will also help those who need that kind of individualized, personalized support. Next slide, please. Okay, this is the one that shows what are some essential. You have a student who has difficulty in a group setting from time to time for part of the time, not the entire day. He still or she has to learn to be part of a group, but for some periods of time, maybe he or she has a separate work area. You have rules that are posted with pictures, photos, preferably photos rather than picture icons, because photos reveal the image much more clearly and learners can connect with it much more easily. And then making sure that you have a designated safe space, calming space, not a timeout, but this is an area, this is a small little space where the student can go and calm down, counting breaths and all that. And then making sure that you use those visual supports with your student on a consistent basis, because almost all of the situations that cause problem behaviors, students will benefit from some kind of visual guidance, visual support. And in addition to that, you may have a student who may reach out and do something to the person next to them or something. So it may help to have a kind of a visual boundary, a personal space for that student. You can just put up some kind of masking tape around the desk on the floor. You can mark it so that is marks personal space. Next slide, please. So the other thing that you can help the student with, this is personalized for that student, is rules cue cards. That is, you cue the student with certain rules. If the student is screaming and engages in that behavior frequently, then the student needs the set of cue cards. Because of the problems with the screen, I do have all these materials next to me to show you, but I am not able to show. So you can have a set of cue cards that you make, that the teacher carries one, the para-educator may carry one, and also maybe the student can be trained to use that. Like, for example, hands to self. Or if the student runs out of the classroom, one of the things that you want to do is to set up 3 or 4 cards, simple little 2 by 2, 2-inch by 2-inch cards with picture icons, or preferably maybe even a photograph. And just like this picture shows, it is on a key ring, and the student is shown, the student is trained, and the student follows those rule cue cards. And this can be used in the classroom setting, this can be used outside, this can be used in the cafeteria, this can be used in a variety of settings. And then one of the important things that you want to train the student is when the student is feeling agitated, the student requests a break. Yeah, next slide, please. So these are rules cue cards. And then the other thing that you want to have is to make sure there is structure and predictability. And one of the things that we found, that the student has difficulty completing or doing an assigned task. One of the things that can happen is to kind of a set of rules for the student to work at his desk, and a kind of a self-monitoring checklist that you can do. So in other words, you finish this work, then you get to do the computer. You work on this one for 10 minutes, and then you get a 3-minute break in the calming space, and then you come back and you work on it for the next 10 minutes, and then you get another calming break for 3 minutes, and then you can go work on the computer. So in other words, you have a visual schedule, and within that visual schedule, you may add a slight mini schedule too. I know this is a lot of work, but when you have a student refusing to do the work again and again and again, and it happens day after day, you do need a solution that's a long-term solution. While it is a lot of work initially, but once you have established it, it'll be most helpful. And the other thing that I want to mention is predictable routines that will help. For example, I have been in classrooms and I have found teachers, I'm sure you are not one of them, but I have found a number of teachers who make Friday afternoons kind of what they call free afternoon or free Fridays or fun Friday or something like that. And they abandon they give up on their routine activities on a Friday afternoon. So in other words, the students have complete freedom to do whatever they want, or sometimes they watch movie for an hour or so, and then they play maybe games for a couple of hours, and not everyone is involved in that. So when you have lack of structure, and Friday afternoon is like that, and then they have, let's say, the weekend when there is kind of almost lack of structure, Monday becomes a very difficult day. So that is why it is important that you have predictable routine. And within that routine, if you want to have a break, you can have that part that is part of your structure. You may have a time when, let's say, you are devoting 20 minutes to playing group games. And again, I'm emphasizing group games because students with autism need to know how to be part of a group. That's something they have got to learn. And the other thing is having, as I mentioned before, having photographs next to your classroom rules. That will help. And having a designated safe space in the classroom that I also mentioned before. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned, and I think that was the second highest category of problem behaviors, and that is coping with changes and transitions. Almost in every classroom that I have been in, transition presents a major challenge for children with autism. One of the reasons is when there is a change, children with autism find it difficult to handle it. And their stress and anxiety level goes up, and they do experience higher levels of stress and anxiety than your average child. So it is important to prepare ahead of time to cope with these changes and transitions. Transitions can occur, let's say you're moving within the classroom from one activity to another, and that may be difficult. So what are some things that you can do? For example, advance warning. Um, 3 minutes before you have, they go, when they start the activity, the green, and then you have almost done, which is the yellow, they are moving, and then when the activity is to finish, they stop. Let us say this is particularly helpful when, let's say you are giving the student has been working on, let's say, math activity or writing activity or something like that. And then the student goes and works on the computer. And some of these children have such a fascination for the computer that they may not want to get out of the computer activity and move on to another teacher-driven activity. So then it is extremely important to use this kind of advanced warning card associated with these kind of maybe different colors, but starting the thing as the student sits in front of the computer and starts its activity, so that's green. But then it is fixed time. You can combine it with a timer, and then 3 minutes before a warning, maybe 1 minute before another warning, and then the stopping the activity. So the student has to be trained to do that. The other one is a set of pictured cue cards that you can use. One of the other things that you can use is, for example, the student is, goes to the playground. And in the playground, the student plays, has fun, and then it's time for them to line up and come back to the classroom. And that becomes a problem, that transition. The student doesn't want to give up the swing or whatever he's playing with or playing on. And then that is when you have to begin a bit before everybody is lining up, and that particular student or one or two students that you have, they need to receive advanced cue. It could be a song that you have, or it could be a musical instrument that you can use. One of the things that I often recommend is what is called a stir xylophone, and then you play that. That's an indication that within 3 minutes or 2 minutes, whatever time you set up, they are all going to line up. So you can even say, play the stir xylophone, or you can have that particular student who has difficulty lining up to hold that stir xylophone and play that, and another student can say line up, and they all begin to line up. So that's a way to train the student that this particular activity is over, we are moving on to the next one. And the visual schedule should also help the student to the next activity, so that he himself, and you take it to the playground as well. You take it to the recess as well. And it's not just for the recess, it may be you're going to the gym, it may be going to the cafeteria, and the student actually moves that. And you may not use one of those Velcroed folder schedule. You may use a technology oriented schedule. And it is important that the student learns how to move that, how to point to the icon, because frequently I see an adult taking the student's finger and pointing to the icon. You really have to focus. The icons have to be limited, and the student has to be trained how to move it himself, so that he makes the connection to the next activity himself or herself, instead of the adult moving, totally prompting the move, and the student is not making that connection between the activity, the icon, the picture icon, and what the activity is going to happen next. And this will help. And one of the things that I will talk about is when there is some kind of a fire drill or assembly, how do you handle that kind of transition as well? Next slide, please. And it is important, I know most of you may not be using this kind of a folder, but some situations it may be helpful to have a folder, and making sure if you use technology, as I said, limit the number of icons so that the student is familiar with that. Which type of schedule you are going to use, making sure, decide on the format. You have to train the student to use it independently. And try to use it within the task, within the math task. If you can make it so that he works or she works for 10 minutes and then little break and then another 10 minutes, because if 20 minutes or 25 minutes or 30 minutes that's assigned for that activity is too long and you're having problem with the student completing it, and every day there is a kind of a tantrum or refusal to do, it may be that you have to provide a mini schedule within that activity for that specific student. And also, you have to make sure that visual supports are available during unstructured activities as well, during recess, lunchtime, gym, and all of that. Next slide, please. Now let's look at some student scenarios. I know that I have not identified only what you had mentioned about the behaviors. These are some other situations that you may come across. And how do we make sure we have a predictable environment? Mark is a very high functioning student. He's in kindergarten and he loves to read, and he's so high functioning that he is particularly fascinated with reading about space and space exploration and astronomy and all that. And that's what brings him great joy. And he does experience meltdowns, unfortunately. And when there is a sudden transition, that causes problem for him and a change in the environment. And this is an incident that actually happened in one of the classrooms that I visited. The furniture in the classroom was completely rearranged between Friday and when he came back the next time, and it just didn't look anything like what he had seen before. And particularly his favorite area, the book center, had been moved. And that was enough to agitate Mark. He started acting completely out of control. He started throwing the books, throwing the blocks, and even knocked down the chairs because he was so frightened by what happened, that his stress level went up so much. For him, this was total confusion, that his world had changed. So what happened in this particular case was, of course, he was immediately sent to the office to be disciplined. And one of the things, the sad things that happened was, he was, because of this it was pretty serious, challenging behavior, he was moved to a less inclusive, from a inclusive setting, he was moved to a less inclusive setting. So, but one of the things that would have helped Mark for this kind of change in the environment, he should have been primed for these changes. He is high functioning, so he would even understand if you showed a classroom map of how the furniture may be changed. He would even be able to read those words if you said the book area will be here in this corner, and these centers would be here, the calming space would be here. He is one of those children who would have understood even a classroom redesigned map, and how the furniture will be there, how the small group activity where it will take place. And this is something not once shown will help him. He does have to see that again and again so that it becomes part of his new expectation. And if photos are attached, that would even benefit him greatly. But this previous preparation is so critical for a child with autism. And that would have helped this particular child and children with similar needs. Thank you. Next slide, please. So another situation. This is again another situation that I saw. Whenever there is a transition, let's say they changed from group activity to independent activity, or from an independent activity when they were working on the computers and back to group reading lesson, that caused Brian, again another kindergartner, and it can happen to anybody else, is who is actually highly verbal, and he's also reading at the first grade level, but during transitions you would see him more like a toddler. He runs around the classrooms, hides under the table, and sometimes even if the door is open or if somebody is coming in, he even tries to run out of the classroom. So what happens in his particular case that I observed was, when he is running around the classroom, you know, the paraeducator tries to stop him, tries to get from under the desk, and they try to chase him. Once they get him, he is usually sent to timeout. So this is something I had observed a few times. And unfortunately, this was more a reactive type of situation instead of a reflective approach. And there are things that he could be taught. First of all, watching, close supervision to see as soon as that activity is over, you go stand next to him and prepare him. And actually it should start a few minutes before, so that he is helped to see the next activity on his schedule. And he himself moves to the next activity. And this should happen a few minutes before. And if he engages in this kind of running despite that, then there should be a stop sign posted on the door so that he does not run out. And he has to be taught, when you see the stop sign, stop, freeze, turn around and point to the chair where he has to go and sit down. And then the other thing that he can be taught is to count to 10, to take calming breaths. And this should happen several times a day when he is in that calming space, so that he learns, when he's feeling that kind of fidgetiness and agitation, he learns to count and take deep breaths. And so those are new skills. And there are various other things. Maybe he can have a peer walk him, take him after he has moved that on his visual schedule to the next activity. He could have a peer take him to the next activity. And there are several other possibilities that you can use. And also the next activity that he's going into should be highly engaging for him. Maybe that is the reason why he tries to run away. Maybe he doesn't have a role to play. Maybe he's afraid of that group activity. Maybe he can have, if it is some activity where they're sitting on the floor and each person has an individual mat or something like that, maybe he can go get that mat before the next activity begins, and his name is on the mat, so that he looks at his name, he picks up that mat, and he goes and sits on that group before the activity begins. So there are a variety of new skills that he can be taught, instead of just routinely he runs or he hides under the table and then he goes to timeout. He does not learn what it is that he needs to do in order to be compliant. Next slide, please. And several other student scenarios. For example, again, this dealing with transition, you find that the usual route that you take to the playground is no longer available. So you have to take a different route. and you want to prevent that triggering a meltdown in your students with autism. So you come up with a kind of a new kind of technique, or you can say new idea. You announce that you're going to measure the distance, count the number of steps, or the number of steps that you take, the number of feet that you cover, number of inches. You can just come up with your own creative way between the classroom and the playground. But you're going to use a different route. And so that the different route that you are taking to the playground will not cause some kind of agitation in that student. Then when you arrive at the playground, after taking the different route, you stay there and spend the recess time. Another situation where the student may be agitated is, let's say you have a child who's jumping on the trampoline, and many children with enjoy jumping on the trampoline. We know that. And she is jumping, she's having fun, and when the gym class is over, the rest of the students are lining up and they're going back to the classroom, but this particular student is refusing to leave the gym. And the paraeducator is with her. Again, use advanced cue to remind her about the next activity. And you can again use some kind of a music or a song or some kind of a transition signal. And show her the visual schedule. And also, it's important for her to know when again she will get a chance to use the trampoline. And if she is still agitated all the way, maybe she could spend 5 minutes in that safe space. I do want to mention that safe space should be very carefully monitored, should be timed, and it should not be abused where the children spend minutes and minutes and minutes and 20 minutes and 30 minutes there, but it should be maybe 3 minutes and maximum maybe 5 minutes, and then gradually reduced. And the student has to come back and return back to the task that you want him or want her to do. Next slide, please.
Next, we have a poll asking everyone to identify techniques they routinely use.
Thank you very much, Deb. Okay, what are the techniques that you yourself use? I have shared a number of techniques so far. What are some things that you use? Do you teach replacement behavior, new skills? Do you coach calming and stress reduction techniques? Do you use timed breaks? And okay, about 43% do use, so it's going up still, use advance warning before transition. That is most helpful. And teaching replacement behavior. Maybe we could use some work on that. And modeling, how to reflect. And you can yourself demonstrate through sharing an example when you felt a little agitated, how you took calming breaths to calm yourself down. And this is one way they can try to identify that everyone feel those moments of agitation, frustration, and anger, and then how we try to handle that feeling. Okay, thank you. Okay, so the one that came up the highest is you are preparing your students with the transition in advance. Okay. is shared. So what are some instructional support that you can provide? We talked about environmental support. One of the things is using universal design for learning. That is, while we are making all those adjustments in terms of the environment, one of the things that you want to make adjustment is in your instruction. Give lots and lots of opportunities for students to engage with that instruction. You use a variety of techniques. Different students respond in different ways, because why is the student not able to do that task? Are we adapting that task for that student to be able to engage? Are we presenting the information in a variety of ways to help that student to connect with that? And are we providing different, diverse, reducing the complexity level of the student to be able to respond, show what he or she has learned? So these are the three different universal design for learning formats. Multiple means of engagement, multiple ways to represent that information, and multiple ways for the student to express, show what he or she has learned. And also it is important to offer visual and verbal both supports. And sometimes we have to add that concrete representational items for that student to connect with. And then you have to adapt that task. For example, some children need that additional visual, additional back and forth conversation. Let's say we are presenting a video. It should be very brief and short. We cannot have videos, expect children to engage with that for 15 minutes. It can be a 3-minute video, 5-minute video, and with interactive back and forth conversation, connecting some pictures, answering some questions, and children having choices to respond to questions and all that. So we have to reduce the complexity level. Then if, let's say, the task is writing, and writing presents a great deal of difficulty for a lot of children, and certainly for children with autism as well. So how can we make that, with reducing the complexity level? One of the things in the beginning, the student may be just filling in a blank, and that blank may be filled in with just a photo or a picture. So that is the writing task. Gradually, they are doing it for 3 or 4 blanks. Maybe initially it's 1 blank, several blanks. And then there may be the last sentence. After you have provided all the sentences, the student is completing 1 sentence independently, choosing from 2 or 3 choices. So this may look like writing for a student. So that is, you are reducing the complexity level, you are adapting that level, and providing personalized support for that student. So that's one thing. And similarly, for math, you may do, instead of having, let's say you are having a math worksheet that you are giving, it is important that the student may be doing as many as you want, but at the same time, when the student looks at a paper with 20 problems, the student may tear it up and throw it. So in order to avoid that, maybe the student can do the first 5, take a 3-minute break, come back, and do the next 5, which is maybe the last 5 problems, and may skip some of the ones in the middle, or he may do the first 5 and then the next 10 to 15 and maybe skip the last. So you can make those adaptations and reduce the complexity level. Another way is to use some kind of a structured teaching, and that is the student these are tasks that the student can independently complete. These are not tasks that the student has to learn for the first time. And for that, you have a set of boxes with things for the student to do that the student can completely do them independently. And then the student completes one set of items, puts it in the finished box, and then next set of items, let's say you have a set of these 4 or 5 boxes, and you may reduce it in the beginning to 2. He finishes it, puts it in the finished box, next takes the next box, puts it, completes it, works on it, finished box, and then at the end, the student may have a preferred activity. Next slide, please. And the other thing that you can do is have some kind of, as I mentioned already, the instructional flexibility for active participation, and to make sure that they participate in all of the activities as much as possible, but you reduce the amount of time. Then you provide communication supports, academic support, and you also modify the task characteristics. If it is a complex task, you simplify it, you break it down. And if you're, let's say you're working on a lesson on rocks and minerals, how can you make that hands-on? How can you have the student have touch and feel it? And how can you help the student to connect with that? And as I mentioned before, if the student finishes 10 problems, then student can work on a preferred activity or go to the calming space, then work on the next 10 problems or 5 problems. And teach the student how to request a break. And then the other thing is opportunities to make choices. That is very empowering when the student can make a choice. But the choice is not doing nothing and a certain activity, but the choice is between I'm doing this or I'm doing that. I am doing either the first 5 problems or the second 5 problems. I'm doing either this writing or I am doing the matching the pictures to the vocabulary words. It is not I'm not doing anything, but I'm doing work. But reasonable choices, but lots of opportunities to make choice. Next slide, please. And the other thing, if you can at all incorporate throughout the day, especially if you're in a self-contained setting for students with autism, this is in maybe initial stages when the student is getting used to the classroom environment, make sure you have several breaks incorporated within your daily routine. When I say breaks, this is not for them to sit down and do nothing. This is planned breaks with planned activities. Maybe a 5-minute music and physical activity break. Maybe 3 to 5 minutes of yoga exercise. Maybe you do a little bit of drama and role play, and most children have, and you can play using your vocabulary words. You can play the charades game, and making sure the student has access to the assistive technology support. And then one of the things, I mean, I have those actual items to show, but like this one, for example, the student has the opportunity to express his likes and dislikes about something. How can we weave that into our daily routine? And lots of engaging hands-on activities is very important. We need to look at our instruction and see how much of it is really hands-on, because that is the best way the student will learn, by the tactile, by the feeling, by doing it. And then also, one of the important things is to build and strengthen your learners' emotional competence, being able to recognize feelings and then understand that, and then show how to respond to that behavior, respond to that feeling with the appropriate behavior. Next slide, please. And as I said, build several breaks into the activity, and then gradually reduce the breaks, and give the student a break card so that he or she can use it. But not abuse it. Thank you. Next slide, please. I know I'm going over time. I apologize. And watch out for situations that can trigger behavior problems. Plan ahead and watch out. Are you giving enough assistance to the student? Are the directions given to the student clear? Is that what's causing the student to refuse to do the task? Or is the student not understanding when you give multiple step direction? It has multiple steps in that direction. And the student understands either the first step and follows that, or the last step, but in the intermediate steps, there are 2 and 3, the student completely not connecting. So is the student requiring a long time to complete something? Or the student finds that there is no ending point. So that is something the student has to be trained to see, that yes, we have a small group activity. Yes, we have a reading activity, but it's not something that's going to go on all day. It is going to be 20 minutes. At the end of it, he has something else to do. And sometimes activities that are not preferred by the student, especially, let's say, writing or math, that could also cause, and so you need to have advanced preparation before that. And the student may perceive some of these as not relevant, that's not unusual, especially when given a task that they don't see as helpful to them. So you may have to offer some choices in that case. Maybe they still do some of it, but may not be required to do all of it. Next slide, please. Okay, and assistive technology, most of you may be already familiar with many of these things, but a combination of both PowerPoint presentation, technology, application with the lots and lots of apps that are available, and at the same time, making sure that you are not overwhelming the student with 64 icons or 32 icons when the student is struggling to identify 5 or 6. So limit the number of icons that you use, gradually increase it. You may have to even go down to a level where they're making a choice, learning to make a choice. Or use something like this where they're using one at a time, one talking communicator to indicate, this is something, for example, you can use as they begin an activity and they get a signal that it will be over in 3 minutes, and then the activity is over. You can use it for a variety of things, and they can learn to have it programmed by themselves. They can program it, or they can have their peer program it for them. So use technology, but match it to the individual student needs, not something that's applicable to everybody and a number of icons. Personalize it for that student. Next slide, please. And calming support. One of the things why we do calming is not only to reduce those problem behaviors, but to help the student to independently develop self-regulation. And that self-regulation will help the student to pay attention, focus and concentrate, and to be able to listen better. And when they do that, their learning will increase. And there are a variety of calming and self-regulation techniques that you can adopt and pursue. Mindful breathing exercises, kind of mindful movement using a few yoga exercises. Or if you do not want to use yoga, you can just use some kind of physical exercise. 3-minute break, 5-minute break, but built into the routine. Or you can use music, or you can use music in the morning and you can use physical exercise in the afternoon. You can use definitely some instruction on learning about feelings and connecting with the emotions and how to respond to those emotions. And then teaching them the turtle technique, how to calm down. And the next slide will show you that. And then you can use a set of color. This is this total technique, and that is recognizing that you're feeling upset or angry, thinking stop, just like the turtle, pull your head in and going into the shell. You're taking deep breaths and you're calming down. And then after 3 minutes, 2 minutes, whatever time that you teach them, this is something you teach the entire class, not just one student. And then you individually teach that and reinforce that with that particular student. Coming out of the shell when calm and think of solutions to the problem. And let's take this example. Alex taking him to the gym or cafeteria has a problem. He has a meltdown. He doesn't have the coping skills to handle a crowd or a gathering or a noisy cafeteria. So prepare him in advance, as I have said many times. Find a quieter area of wherever you're going, the gym or the cafeteria, and then remind the student to practice mindful breathing exercise as he has or as she has transitioned to that noisy area. That will make him less stressful and easier to manage that noisy, crowded area, even though, for example, Alex is sitting in a much more quieter area of that cafeteria. And then if he continues to exhibit severe fidgety behavior, be prepared with the help from a paraeducator or some other person to take him back to the classroom. Thank you. Next slide, please. And these are all different ways you can use to calm down. This is a sequence you can follow. Create a space, practice it daily, build it as part of your routine. That will help reduce anxiety and stress, and the student will gain calmness and attention control. And ultimately, what you want is to strengthen that self-management, and you will be able to do that. Next slide, please. And these are all some of the resources that you can use. And as I said, I just have written the second edition of this positive behavior interventions for children with autism. Next slide, please. Okay, and we have several webinars coming up soon, and I'll be presenting one on paraeducators, and then another one on students with severe and multiple disabilities. How do we provide engaging and interactive literacy activities and math activities? They are all coming up in the future. I want to take this opportunity to thank AbleNet and especially Deb Howseth for helping me today. And again, I'm sorry things were a little, not usual, somewhat unusual with the technology issues. It's not something that we go through every time, but I'm extremely grateful to AbleNet for having me present this webinar. And I thank each and every one of you for your patience and for joining this session. I hope you found some valuable tools to take back with you. And this is particularly helpful at this time when many of these children who have been in virtual schooling will need additional emotional support. And some of these techniques need to be implemented much more intensively in order to help these children. And also, finally, this is kind of usually celebrated. April is Autism Awareness Month. I think every day, every month is Autism Awareness. But I hope you have a great month. And thank you.
Thank you, Padmaja. I appreciate all your efforts and all of your information. That will conclude our webinar for today. Thank you.